Compiled Contact Reports on Economics Part 3. Contact Report 524.
We are also interested in the whole thing, which is why we have made various forays into the future, and why we have seen that in the last 3 days, a compromise has been reached, and the great financial disaster has been averted. On the one hand, this will be done by raising the debt ceiling by several $1 trillion and by implementing a small austerity program. The whole thing is absolutely ridiculous, because this compromise does not solve the problem, because simply by raising the debt limit, printing and circulating more money and making small savings, this does not change anything. The problems still exist, and they can only be solved by radical and far-reaching measures, and consequently there is still the threat of public finance and economic collapse, worldwide and in all probability. We have not yet figured out what is actually happening, but one thing is certain: the crisis is continuing, not only in the United States, but also in the dictatorial European Union, and in other countries around the world. Radical action would have to be taken to change everything for the better and lead to a development that would solve all the problems.
But the USA is not capable of this, nor is the EU and many other states, because the majority of the rulers and other responsible parties are not capable of keeping a good budget, as is unfortunately also the case with most other states and rulers worldwide. If a state's financial management was correct, there should not be any national debt, but rather a certain financial cushion to the contrary. Unfortunately, however, the exact opposite is the case, because all those in positions of responsibility in governments, etc., who have to manage public finances, are only out to run up debts and squander the money en masse. This is also the case in Switzerland, as the past has shown. I am thinking of Finance Minister Merz, who saved a huge amount of money in the national budget that could have been used to reduce debt. Unfortunately, when he was not re-elected, others, including other parties, took the helm, and they immediately screamed for more spending, so that the savings were immediately squandered. The point of all of them is that it is not their own money that they are wasting, but the taxpayers' money, so they themselves do not suffer any damage. And the kicker is that financially strong companies and the wealthy are given tax breaks, while the working people have to bear the heaviest tax burdens. The real question is where equality for all is to be found. The working class has to pay more and more taxes, such as state and value-added taxes, etc., which makes it more and more difficult or even impossible for many people to live a sensible and carefree life, while the financially strong, like the rich, practically get away with a sandwich of taxes. Unfortunately, it is also the case that the state is taken as a model by the people when it comes to getting into debt, and consequently the state imitates the principle of state debt mania and debt addiction, and also lives on a large scale and becomes increasingly insolvent, even to the point of private bankruptcy. And what basically drives the states into horrendous debt is, on the one hand, the expenditure for the military and its armament, and on the other hand, for the entire civil service, administrative and governmental apparatus, which is completely overstaffed in practically every state, and, in addition, devours vast sums of money as a result of horrendous and unjustifiably high salaries, which have to be paid by the taxpayers. The postponement of ailing government bonds in the form of debentures is also part of governmental financial mismanagement. But it is also the case that institutions and state organizations, etc., are created. Nonsensical associations, cultural workers and companies, etc., are supported, and buildings, etc., are constructed, which also demand vast sums of money that can only be spent if debts are incurred. This is in my home country, Switzerland, as well as in all other countries of the world. When I think that Italy has a debt of around 1.8 trillion, 1,800 billion euros, and Germany more than 3 trillion euros, I am horrified to see what the future holds for Europe and the world. To my knowledge, Switzerland has only about 130 billion francs in debt, but every franc is also too much. But if you take the United States, with its $14.414 trillion in debt to date, and China alone owes around 1.3 trillion, $1,300 billion, Then I am told that the United States of America has reached the end of its world power ambitions, and will sooner or later have to cede this position to the newly emerging China and abandon its lying world democratization plans, which the former 28th President of the United States of America has so far been unable to fulfill. U.S. President Thomas Woodrow Wilson had proclaimed at the time of the First World War, but he also wanted to achieve this goal by force, war, and terror. The truth is that the United States has not really been a world democratizer, but has undoubtedly been committed to world domination and control through evil violence, wars, mass murder, destruction, etc. This is connected with the worldwide spread of the infant language English, with which it is also impossible to produce a single reasonable sentence. As with Napoleon Bonaparte, the idea of the U.S. president was to bring about a democratization of the whole world, which of course meant with a warlike background that the end justifies the means. Under the guise of this idea of global democratization, the U.S. has since then waged wars and murderous and intriguing intelligence operations around the world, committing and continuing to commit atrocities and war and intelligence crimes and destruction. Torture of the worst kind and insidious killings and official executions are also part of these degenerate atrocities, as are assassinations and mass murders in many forms. The way the USA has acted and continues to act has also been done since ancient times by other world powers, be it ancient China, Egypt, Carthage, Rome, England or Russia, and the former Soviet Union, etc. But they all lost their position of world power, and the reasons for this were always and without exception the same: military, ideological, political, and economic, and in some cases also religious. All the past empires collapsed because they had too much land, colonies, districts and provinces, etc., too much military, too much armament, and too much administrative apparatus, which ruined them financially, overtaxed their economies, acted politically wrongly, and followed destructive ideologies. And it must also be said that when world powers come to the point where they have to seek help and assistance and cooperation from other states for warfare and for the economy, etc., as the USA did with the war in Iraq and the disaster in Afghanistan, it is the beginning of the end of an autonomous state. In all of this, when state expenditure exceeds income and debts are incurred, a state makes itself dependent on those other states with whom it is in debt. This dependence on other states and their economies also arises when a country does not have enough of its own resources and does not have its own and sufficient food production. If there is not enough food in a country, then a stink arises, and this usually leads to civil war, which then eats up and destroys the state from within. The same problem arises with energy, especially oil today. The USA alone is probably the biggest energy consumer in this respect, and is more dependent on oil than any other country. The U.S. cannot produce enough of the black gold at home, and therefore has to purchase huge quantities from other countries. The U.S. has oil reserves for only 3 months, and if these are used up and not replenished, then the whole infrastructure collapses: industry and commerce, the military, the food supply, the operation of hospitals, and so on. When I look at the United States and the many acts of war it has waged and continues to wage, the magnanimity of the state is clear to see, for how many wars it has lost, and how much worse it has made things much worse than they were before it intervened. One need only think of the more recent period when the 2 Bushes, with the U.S. military, raged in Iraq, spreading endless death, torture, torment, misery that still continues today. Clinton and other U.S. presidents were also no better, with only the atrocities in Vietnam being mentioned. Like the past, so is the present and the future, but the USA still does not understand that its power is over, and that in its state the addiction to debt is driving everything to ruin, from which such enormous damage has already been caused financially, economically, politically, ideologically, and religiously, rarely, and which can hardly be repaired, if at all. And this has been done in the USA for centuries, with the worst forms of damage being conjured up from the First World War into the third millennium by completely war-loving and absolutely incapable presidents. The success of this is that all the U.S. behavior and its desire for world domination has given rise to an international terrorism which is clearly U.S. fault, and which nothing really effective can yet counter. The incredibly ridiculous magnanimity of the United States, which Germany and other countries are also joining, cannot be used to combat terrorism, as is also shown by the ridiculous measures taken in respect of Libya, Yemen, Egypt, and Syria. And what the U.S. has done since time immemorial, and what is now emerging as a consequence, is now innocently being made the scapegoat of President Barack Obama and held responsible for everything. He now has to pay for everything, for which he is unjustifiably accused of incapacity by his power-hungry opponents, and by all the stupid and primitive people who cry along with the power-hungry. The whole thing is not about getting the USA back on its feet and strengthening the country. It is just about allowing power-hungry people to make their mark and get the presidency. And once they have achieved this, they disregard what Obama wants to achieve or wanted to achieve for the present and the future, respectively, in order to continue in the old power-hungry, destructive and state and humanity, and life-despising métier, as their predecessors did, some of whom must be called criminals and criminals in particular, because they brought millions of deaths to earthly humanity with wars and revolutions that they instigated and had carried out all over the world. If I want to express my opinion further, I have to say that the United States is completely obsolete in terms of politics, military, religion, sects, ideology, legislation, culture, and ecology. A fundamentally outdated system of government has brought about a standstill in state power. But there is also a rejection of a thorough social, political, ideological, and cultural change to progressive changes and developments, so that nothing new and valuable can emerge and establish itself from which great and positive things and values can emerge. The USA is also far away from the majority of all states with regard to ecological problems respectively, the interrelationships between the human being, all living beings, and the environment respectively the budget of nature, as well as the climate. The same thing also happened to all other world powers, which ultimately had to give up their positions of world power. This is how I see things.
A long speech, dear friend, but I have to say that you have given the true facts.
Some squibs will probably say that I am meddling in politics again.
Contact report 543.
Thanks for your confirmation. See here, I have received this question and I will answer it openly in a bulletin. If you have anything to say about it, please do.
Question: what do you think of the so-called European Rescue Scheme, ESM? Can we use it to save the financially weak countries, Greece, Portugal, Italy, etc.? Who can tell us where all the billions we pump into this bottomless pit will really end up? This is all so complicated to understand that I would really like someone to explain it to me. You and Ptah do not talk about such things anymore, but could you do it for once? Hans Bayer, Germane.
I do not want to talk about that because it is no longer in our interest to deal with such Earth humans nonsense. So I guess it is up to you to write a corresponding answer for a bulletin.
I actually thought you might say that. Then I will model such an answer and tell you how I see the whole thing. But maybe you can say something about it?
A short assessment, so to speak.
I mean, yes.
That's what I want to do.
Good. Then I will make an effort to express my thoughts on the matter of the question, and to translate them into understandable words, which, however, will not be pleasant for certain people. So then. Answer. I cannot give you a clear answer to your question whether the whole world is going bankrupt, except that it is extremely unpleasant what is happening in all countries of the earth on the financial markets, in governments, and in the economy. But when I look at the whole thing, it seems that everything is going downhill, is getting worse, and is heading for global financial and economic collapse if something does not change for the better soon. If the people continue to have such rivets and zeros in their governments, who have no shred of intelligence and reason in financial management and governance, then soon there is nothing to be saved. If all those in positions of responsibility in politics and economics continue to behave as ignorant primitive savages in matters of finance, politics, and economics, as they have done for many decades, then sooner or later there must be a crash. If reason and logic are not at last called for, and if the loudmouthed bank bosses, bank managers and economic bosses, as well as the state finance ministers and other authoritative rulers, are not replaced by authoritative specialists who do not work for their own greed for power, their own image, and not only for their own good, and also not by horrendous salaries in their own sacks, but for the state, and thus for the people, then everything can still end very badly and lead to a violent collapse of a worldwide form. But as long as all these experts are at the helm in all decisive positions in governments, banks, and in the economy, who only have their own reputation, their greed for power, and their wealth and personality in mind, nothing better and above all nothing good can come out of it. So it is also questionable whether the so-called European Rescue Scheme ESM can change things for the better and save the big debtor countries Greece, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, to which others will soon be added. And the probably last general idiocy in debt-making is that debt should be made in unlimited form, far beyond the national gold reserves, as it already happened in the USA in the 1970s, when the morbidly stupid 37th U.S. President Richard Milhous Nixon arranged that the U.S. dollar could no longer be tied to the national gold reserves from then on, and that debt could therefore be made in unlimited amounts. The conclusion of this abysmal idiocy has since led to a mountain of debt for the United States of America, amounting to over $15 trillion. The same incredible idiocy is now also being considered for the European Union and its member states, respectively. This is intended to solve the problem of countries' debt, which of course goes far beyond any idiocy ever created financially, and must ultimately lead to unprecedented inflation. But what else can the people expect from their rulers if they have no idea whatsoever about financial management and drive the states into unlimited debt? And when you consider that the biggest debtors in the EU are the German government and have driven their own country into an enormous mountain of debt, in the very place where the loudest mouths are, then it can make the thoughtful citizens' hats fall off in anger and despair. The irresponsible nonsense of the introduction of the euro alone should have been prevented by the German government and by the EU heads in Brussels. But this was not done because the government brains, at least among those named, were full of straw or sawdust or other worthless stuff, so the whole thing could not be prevented. So it was also impossible for these confounded brain-blowers to realize that first all EU states should have been debt-free, and that it should have been compulsory for each state to have a respectable financial cushion to call its own. But this was not the case, because where there is only an empty brain or a brain filled with straw or sawdust, neither intelligence nor reason or logic can find any grounds. It also never occurred to those in charge that it would have taken at least another 20-30 years to introduce the euro, and that this would have been the case only if all EU countries had been instructed in this way to become first and foremost debt-free and to stabilize public finances. But this was not the case, and as in the past, the debt-making process also continues today, because there are no financiers at the helm, only financially uninformed idiots. But once a person comes along who can save and handle the state finances in a correct way, then those idiots will come along who will once again spend the money they have saved on nonsensical things in order to realize their crazy and feeble-minded ideas and wishes, regardless of losses and a possible collapse of the state. And the other bad thing is that the population of every state where such action is taken takes the whole thing as a model and acts in the same way. As a result, it is not only the states that are hopelessly in debt and will never be able to reduce their mountain of debt again, but also the population, the entire economy, and the banks that act in the same way. In the end, all this mismanagement is such that in every country the population has to pay for the debts incurred by the governments, the economy, and the banks. Unfortunately, there is an all-round lack of intelligence, understanding, reason, and logic, both in every government, in the banks, and in the economy, and also among the population of every country, and where these values are lacking, as we know, hops and malt are lost. So that is what I see and what I understand. What is your opinion?
If I am to comment on this, then I have to say that your statements correspond to a large extent to the way I also see the whole thing. So it is equally my meaning, which you present. There is probably nothing more to be said about it, because everything corresponds to correctness and reality, and thus to the truth. Your words, however, will not bring joy to many, but will bring much anger and enmity against you.
Contact Report 544.
In foreign policy, too, a great deal of harm would be caused, and this, economically as well as through criminal military and secret service actions, and everything would become even worse than it was the case under the two Bush who had might.
Aha, so then this evil can be avoided by through the rational ones of the USA population. But with the USA, the whole thing cannot go on forever the way it was before Barack Obama came, who was to be thanked for the end of the Iraq engagement and the elimination of Osama bin Laden, but also for the huge humanitarian progress for the American people concerning the comprehensive health insurance, which this human-hostile Romney really wants to abolish again. When I consider what you confided to me as early as 1975 on my great journey, that the superpower USA could come to an end after 2020 according to your probability calculations, if nothing changes for the better in this state until then, and if allies with the USA continue to distance themselves from this state or even become open enemies, then Obama might perhaps be the crucial point that this can still be prevented, couldn't he?
That could be the case, but one must also consider what the Obama successors will then continue to do and what domestic and foreign policy they will pursue, because this will also determine what will happen after 2020.
Back in the year 1975, you mentioned on the one hand in particular the tremendous contradictions in terms of the politics, the economy, the military machinations, the decay of the culture as well as the increasing phenomenon of religions and sects, and the serious criminal acts or even felonies of the former presidents of the USA, and said that if one would continue to muddle through these things to the same and still increasing extent, then the collapse would be unavoidable. I have taken good notice of all that, and I can really understand if the result is as you have calculated. Furthermore, you also said at that time that China could then molt into the next world in superpower when the USA collapses, but that this would fundamentally require that China would rally strong allies around itself until then, because these were necessary to have sufficient influence as superpower and to be able to exist as such at all. An economic power alone, such as China would be, which would be dependent on the world economy, you explained, would not be enough to be a superpower. But megalomania could lead to catastrophic attempts and worldwide acts of war in order to achieve a superpower position. But if now, in relation to the USA, one only considers the huge national mountain of debt of more than $16 million, which can no longer be repaid, and for which the ongoing interest can only be paid barely or not even any longer amply, then even the least intelligent one must recognize how things stand with the USA. However, US America is indeed not alone in this, because one only has to think of Germany, France, England, Spain, and Italy, etc., which are equally all around mismanaging and have mountains of debt weighing millions of millions. My home country, Switzerland, is also laid out to run up debt, even if only to the tune of more than 100,000 million, but that too is enough, and there is no one there to stop the bad actions. Aha, so then this evil can be avoided by through the rational ones of the USA population. But with the USA, the whole thing cannot go on forever the way it was before Barack Obama came, who was to be thanked for the end of the Iraq engagement and the elimination of Osama bin Laden, but also for the huge humanitarian progress for the American people concerning the comprehensive health insurance, which this human-hostile Romney really wants to abolish again. When I consider what you confided to me as early as 1975 on my great journey, that the superpower USA could come to an end after 2020 according to your probability calculations, if nothing changes for the better in this state until then, and if allies with the USA continue to distance themselves from this state or even become open enemies, then Obama might perhaps be the crucial point that this can still be prevented, couldn't he?
That could be the case, but one must also consider what the Obama successors will then continue to do and what domestic and foreign policy they will pursue, because this will also determine what will happen after 2020.
Back in the year 1975, you mentioned on the one hand in particular the tremendous contradictions in terms of the politics, the economy, the military machinations, the decay of the culture as well as the increasing phenomenon of religions and sects, and the serious criminal acts or even felonies of the former presidents of the USA, and said that if one would continue to muddle through these things to the same and still increasing extent, then the collapse would be unavoidable. I have taken good notice of all that, and I can really understand if the result is as you have calculated. Furthermore, you also said at that time that China could then molt into the next world and superpower when the USA collapses, but that this would fundamentally require that China would rally strong allies around itself until then, because these were necessary to have sufficient influence as superpower and to be able to exist as such at all. An economic power alone, such as China would be, which would be dependent on the world economy, you explained, would not be enough to be a superpower. But megalomania could lead to catastrophic attempts and worldwide acts of war in order to achieve a superpower position. But if now, in relation to the USA, one only considers the huge national mountain of debt of more than $16 million, which can no longer be repaid, and for which the ongoing interest can only be paid barely, or not even any longer amply, then even the least intelligent one must recognize how things stand with the USA. However, U.S. America is indeed not alone in this, because one only has to think of Germany, France, England, Spain, and Italy, etc., which are equally all around mismanaging and have mountains of debt weighing millions of millions. My home country, Switzerland, is also laid out to run up debt, even if only to the tune of more than 100,000 million. But that too is enough, and there is no one there to stop the bad actions. But to get back to the USA again, one also has to look at all the all-encompassing U.S. mismanagement and all the other inconsistencies as well as the zeros of U.S. presidents, whereby I however exclude Barack Obama, who among all the major zeros up to now drops out of the traditional role in a variety of things. Then I also see that your probability calculation could be fulfilled. Although there are certain things happening under Obama too that must not be seen as right, whereby I am hereof thinking especially of the issue of the remote-controlled drones for the killing of terrorists and terror suspects. Yet you have explained in this connection that the whole of the corresponding body of thought and action does not originate with him, but with those who practically forced him to give his orders and signatures in accordance with their will and demand. You said that he himself would be practically mightless, even though might is officially attributed to him, and it would be held against him that he alone would be able to decide about the deadly drone missions, and in this respect would have taken the rudder directly to himself, whereby he was, is and will also be held responsible for the most diverse military and political machinations that did not, for example do not, correspond to his ideas. Although he is a very mighty man, he is nevertheless dependent on his advisers as well as on all those who have the might to advise him disingenuously, to influence, to direct, and to force him according to their will. These mighty ones are the highest of the military, the Department of War and Defense, the Secret Services, but as well as also politicians, consultants, confidants, banks, the stock exchange and the groups of companies dealing with machines, pharmaceuticals and armaments and the government elites and religious sectarian leaders, etc. But if I now think about your probability calculations, then it makes me all the more assuming that your calculations can come true. When I consider that you explained at that time that the USA is inflicting more and increasingly tremendous damage upon its allies around the world, and that as a result, resistance and even hostility against U.S. America arises. Then I still want to explain, in relation to many predictions that you have made, that many have struck me very often hard, especially because I had to keep silent and was not allowed to give any warnings. Actually, I am quite happy today that you no longer make predictions, because these were always immensely burdening for me, because there was nothing I could do to prevent the events from becoming reality. Although you have allowed me to make an attempt to contact the U.S. government via L, who was working for the CIA, however the U.S. government via the CIA then made unfulfillable demands, which were unfulfillable according to your will, which is why no positive relationship came about. I then actually received the unfulfillable demands in writing. But this too was indeed predicted by you. Consequently, after the fruitless attempt at contact with the U.S. government, I did no longer make any further efforts in this matter, and would also not undertake such efforts again. Moreover, You also said yourselves that the attempt that was carried out would be the first and the last, and that you would therefore not allow anything further hereof. Therefore I will abide by that. But regarding predictions, if I am particularly interested in something of the future, will you same as up to now tell me further facts, as long as I do not publish them? And what will happen if the USA collapses?
We will continue to give you information if you want us to, or if you think it might be necessary to make a prediction available to the public, whereby it must then be a question on your part and only about something very specific that no longer falls within the old scope of the predictions. And what you mention in relation to what I said regarding the U.S. President Barack Obama corresponds to the facts. Serious things are being blamed on him, which are not according to his own decision, but which he simply has to approve perforce. And much of what he wants in terms of positive changes or what he has achieved for the direct welfare benefit of poorer parts of the population is being maliciously negatively attributed to him by envious, might-greedy and rich ones, and evil means are being used to try to abolish again the good that he has achieved. However, regarding what would ensue should the USA fall into ruin, this would mean that under certain circumstances a dictatorship and naked Gewalt would arise, something which has already been emerging for years. The people of the USA are being put on an ever shorter leash, financially exploited, and deprived of everything from which they could benefit, something for which the rich and their hangers-on are mainly responsible, as well as those elite in government who only represent their excessive wealth, their greed for money, and their absolutely personal interests. But this corresponds exactly to the opposite of Barack Obama's ideas, who wants both good and the best for the people, but also for the state itself. And this political and government elite consists of both Republicans, but at the same time also of Democrats. Valuable reforms for the well-being of the population in the state are not in demand. Thus, the already deep-rooted poverty among the people continues to spread, while the rich enrich themselves more and more, whereby the social inequality is ever faster gaining ground. Thus, in the event of a collapse of the USA, only two possibilities can be considered, whereby the one boils down to a dictatorship with evil reprisals and great Gewalt, while the other possibility can be a new rebuilding, if people with a fundamental sense of responsibility reach the government and really do everything possible to bring about an effective and valuable new beginning. However, whether this will happen is currently highly questionable, because at present everything is in a totalitarian way directed towards economic, military, political, and cultural, as well as strictly fundamentalist religious sectarian interests, and towards monstrous lies and disingenuous, human contemptuous, criminal and felonious machinations in every conceivable regard. This also means that the population of the USA is spied on by the secret services and even in a purely neighborly manner, etc., and that their freedom is restricted in every possible way, and this in addition to the Gewalt, as it shows up openly and covertly in various forms. Also regarding China, I must stick to the statements I have made, just like the fact that the USA are a superpower, which spread death, ruin and destruction as well as hatred and intrigue all over the world, wherethrough the worldwide terrorism is steadily being further promoted. A terrorism which Obama is fighting according to the will of those who have forced him to do so and are now shifting the whole might and responsibility for it onto him alone, among other things with remote-controlled, death-bringing drones. And as far as the matter with the U.S. government, the CIA and with you is concerned, the following is to be said. The fact that the attempt to establish contact will fail was due to the imperiousness of the U.S. government and the contacted CIA people to about 92% predictable, however, an 8% possibility remained open that a small success might still occur. This was especially true because agents parked themselves in the restaurant Brückenwaage in Dusnang and kept contact with L in the center. For this reason, there was little hope, And so we assumed, I must confess, that we ourselves also had certain expectations attached to this when we allowed you to try to establish contact with the government of the USA, because a small success might indeed have resulted. We therefore allowed you to make an attempt, whereby, unfortunately, everything proved to be illusory. And it was really nothing more than an attempt. But we also did not want to simply pass over your insistence, so that you could recognize for yourself that such an undertaking is very difficult. But the possibility, which was only 8% open, that something positive could have been achieved, was then nevertheless not crowned with success.
Contact Report 551.
And does terrestrial medicine really not know what the origin of hypertension is? Are the causes really not known?
They are not really looking for them seriously because it is undesirable that someone should find the causes.
Perhaps neither doctors nor drug manufacturers can be interested in finding the causes because they fear an economic collapse of the multi-billion-dollar business.
That hits the nail on the head, as you usually say.
Contact Report 576.
Finally, thriftiness and tidiness are also called virtues, as are thanks and courtesy. Although these two values only correspond to one virtue each if they are meant honestly and effectively, include thanks and courtesy in an honest way, or do not simply correspond to a habit of gratitude and courtesy without their value really being given. Cleanliness and punctuality and good, correct social and economic conformity are also considered virtues which have found their way into the human being's thought, feeling, action, and deed patterns of behavior.
Contact Report 587.
If the negative view of egoism is seen as egomania, it is in contrast to healthy egoism. The non-judgmental view is the factual assertion of psychological egoism, which shows that all the human beings would act de facto egoistically. Equally value-free is the economic model of Homo economicus, which corresponds to a model conception of economic theory, and embodies the human beings who think and act exclusively according to economic principles. He knows only economic goals, and is particularly characterized by qualities such as rational behavior and the pursuit of maximizing benefits. He is oriented towards a complete knowledge of his economic decision-making possibilities, as well as their consequences, and the complete information regarding all markets and characteristics of all goods, and thus towards complete market transparency. Homo economicus as an ideal serves to be able to describe elementary economic interrelationships in theory in a clear and transparent manner, and without practical shortcomings.
Contact Report 593.
Now there is again talk of further sanctions, which the EU and the USA have imposed on Russia, and which Putin will not leave unanswered, because he too will take economic counter-sanctions, which will cause great damage to the EU economy. Those who will suffer as a result will be those who need to maintain economic relations with Russia. And as far as the sanctions by the EU and the USA are concerned, Switzerland will also have to decide whether or not to go along with them. This is because we have so many EU supporters in our country who are betraying and selling off their homeland to the EU, and thus forcing Switzerland into foreign legislation. The bailiffs greet us. But what is really going to happen with regard to the enforcement of sanctions is that there is not exactly agreement on whether, how, and what should be done in this respect. For my part, however, I can imagine that the EU dictatorship fanatics in the government are at least partly thinking up their own sanctions against Russia, or joining those of the EU and the USA. With those who are consciously less well off, one must expect all the wrong and evil to be done, as well as the betrayal and sale of the homeland and its laws, the constitution and the rights of the homeland to the totalitarian EU dictatorship. Then something else. You told me recently that Barack Obama would no longer be the same man he was at the beginning of his presidency.
That is right, because he has been psychologically transformed in his reflecting and striving by all those under whose direct and indirect influence he is.
So he has turned into a different kind of reflecting.
Yes, at least in various political concerns.
It is probably the case that he has been brainwashed psychologically by his opponents, who are both from his own Democratic ranks and from the Tea Party, the Republicans, the economic bosses, the defenders, the military and advisors, etc., without him even realizing it, and now he is swinging like a pendulum at their will. So he is also unable to implement his earlier ideas, because the resistance has become so strong that he can no longer oppose it.
I do not have to comment on that.
Contact Report 611.
Thanks. Your explanations tell very much. Today, the human beings of Earth often carry the music around by schlepping around headphones in the ear and the MP3 players in the jacket pockets. The danger is particularly on the streets and traffic, because they no longer hear any outside sounds. Consequently, there are many fatal accidents because of that. In the past, the humans carried around portable radios and let these play at full volume, which created a lot of trouble. And as you have said, it's the howling and yowling as well as the instrumental noise and racket, which on the whole has become referred to as music since the 1980s, and which makes the human being psychopathic and crazy, besides being equipped to wreak much calamity. And indeed, in addition to the fact that those human beings whose music sense is directed towards good, harmonious, and positive music are semi-driven into madness. From this I gather that according to your words, as a result of this catastrophic musical style prevailing since the 1980s, precisely that which is falsely called music, a very unpleasant future is to be expected. This also, therefore, simply because the human beings who indulge in this wailing and racket, which they call music, have no true sense of life, as well as no thoughts and feelings of a healthy self-worth, let alone because any sense to follow the creational natural laws and recommendations, through which to them the true love, freedom, harmony, and peace would be their own, and these high values would come to life and would be represented. As I see the matter, the whole thing is running once again towards another catastrophe and beyond. Thus again a new act of war may be pending, particularly because of the Ukraine, as well as a threatening financial debacle and a massive economic disaster, along with tremendous political turmoil and malicious and deadly Ausartungen. If the threats and senselessnesses of the EU dictatorship are looked at, considered and analyzed, in particular the threats and sanctions against Russia, and namely together with the United States, which of course has already fully grown into a serious international debacle, then comprehensive warlike machinations already threaten with the EU, the USA, and Russia. And then, only the EU dictatorship carries the blame for this, which itself wants to incorporate the Ukraine as a bulwark against Russia, which is still advocated and striven for by the inexperienced Ukrainians, because they do not recognize the dictatorship form of the EU.
Contact Report 620.
With your various predictions in the 1950s and 1960s as well as 1970 ES, you have warned the world governments about these events, as these have already come about for quite some time. You had even sent your predictions to many daily newspapers and radio stations in Europe and the US, but no one has responded to these. If your predictions were read at all, then you were ridiculed as a foolish dreamer and do-gooder. Consequently, nothing was undertaken to make decisive and valuable preparations, precisely in order to take the necessary measures to prevent the whole thing.
And even today there is nothing really useful undertaken to put an end to everything. On the one hand, this is because the rulers are too foolish, too dim-witted as well as absolutely unable to see the effective reality and its truth, and to rightly assess everything. But on the other hand, also a blatant erroneous humanism stands in the foreground, which however is given not only with the rulers in sanctimonious form, but especially with the aid organizations which, thereby can beg for a lot of money, as well as the people themselves, who are unable to effectively assess the facts of the matter. And if voices are raised, such as from the Australian government, which explains that Europe needs to change its tune, just as the Australians likewise do, then the advice givers are shouted down and accused of being misanthropic, unhumane and hostile to foreigners, as well as racially hostile ones. On television, rulers and government representatives as well as erroneous humanists spout banally, primitively dense, foolishly and idiotically in discussion broadcasts about the refugee problem, in which however only endless absolute rubbish and nonsense is regurgitated. With all, the talk is also never of the fact that most so-called refugees are nothing other than economic refugees, and in no wise are their lives threatened, which would entitle them to escape to safety. And nothing is said about the fact that a certain percentage of these economic refugees live off of welfare in the wealthy industrialized nations, at the expense of hard-working taxpayers, and yet at the same time, become serious criminals. The drug trade is thereby likewise in the foreground, as well as burglaries, theft, fraud, and even manslaughter and murder, etc. Of course, this cannot be generalized, because in every case, it is always only a certain percentage which must be taken into consideration regarding this. The life-threatened refugees are really truthfully only in small numbers, to whom naturally asylum must also be granted. However, economic refugees belong returned to their ancestral homeland, in which they themselves should strive to build up an existence, and indeed, even if this is hard and connected with very much effort and work. Even to keep some goats and to cultivate a small plot of land in order to obtain their own food, and perhaps also to be able to sell some of it, can be a good start, instead of holding out the empty hands, to let them fill up with foodstuffs free of charge by aid organizations. Exactly this, however, that in the developing countries the human being even reaches for the rake and does something, is prevented by the aid organizations, because if the roasted pigeons are put in the mouth of a human being, then he or she has no further interest thereto, to do something else for this themselves. That's the one thing, and the other is that in general, the economic refugees are not downright poor, but have at their disposal a certain capital which they could usefully use in their homeland, and, as I said, so that some modest small existence could be built up. But no, the money will be utilized for the flight out of the homeland, and these are shamefully abandoned, in the hope to quickly become rich in the industrialized countries, and without too much effort. Therefore, contrary to every rationality and every individual initiative and love of the homeland, the money is handed over to criminal smugglers and black marketeers of human beings, that is to say, human traffickers, who smuggle them out of their countries of origin into countries of transit and ultimately ship them out on inflatable boats, unseaworthy fishing cutters, and other floating death traps, which rigorously with Gavalt, one would have to be broken up and destroyed by professionally trained elite troops, precisely by a multinational peace-fighting troop. Also to say with regard to these smuggler and human being trafficking boats, is that sooner or later these usually go down in the sea due to their dilapidated condition and the overloading of human beings, or are mercilessly and consciencelessly scuppered on the open sea along with man and mouse by the criminal human being traffickers themselves. And if it is considered that the economic refugees and also well-to-do refugees of war pay per person, depending 4,500, 6,000, and even up to 8,000, or more euros for a crossing from a transit country on the Mediterranean Sea to Sicily or Greece, etc., by which the conscienceless ones and criminal smugglers become multimillionaires, then that should stimulate thinking over how poor these refugees really are, and what they could do with the money in their home country in order to build up a modest existence and also to do something about it, even if it's only very slight, in order to improve the poor condition of the home country. In this respect, something valuable can alone be done therethrough, by placing humaneness for the fellow human being in the light of day, and standing by and helping them with word and deed. This, however, is not taken into consideration by the economic refugees, because also in these countries from which they come, the humaneness for the fellow human being, and love for the next one, as well as the help for the next ones, are little sown. So whoever does not want to, this one will not, because it's simpler, and is more comfortable to live in those foreign states at the expense of the people, and to make the cupped hands, where a good government structure, clear laws and regulations, and a good economy are created. It must of course also be clear that the whole thing has nothing to do with the nature of economic refugees. If human beings effectively migrate from developing countries into prosperous foreign states in accordance with law and right, and according to regulatory authorizations and consents, as is customary and rightful worldwide. However, such human beings are provided with all the necessary papers and with the equally necessary financial means. They are or work-wise will be bound to a company, and therefore also lead an orderly life, just as they also completely amply do the civic duties in the host country or new homeland. Quite a few human beings who come from developing countries in this wise also conduct a long-standing occupational study of some kind and integrate themselves extensively in their new homeland, where as a rule they are also qualified and good citizens of the state. However, these human beings are never to be equated with economic refugees, who flee their homelands only for reasons of which, because they have erroneously fallen into the delusion that in the wealthy industrialized countries they would only have to pick up the golden apples which would fall from the trees. Even to have to pick them themselves would already be too much for them. All this is considered just as minimally in any wise by the erroneous humanists and aid organizations, as well as by the leaders of the wealthy industrialized countries, especially foremost in Europe by the responsible ones of the EU dictatorship, as also neither from their representatives in the far too humane political parties and private erroneous humanists. This also includes all the anonymous wrong philanthropists, human fanatics and aid organizations, who raise the whole economic refugee problem ever further through their feeble-minded machinations, instead of rigorously preventing it and granting admittance into the country, and with it also asylum, only to those refugees who actually and verifiably must be considered for any effective acceptable reasons as life-threatening in their homeland. Not only, however, the entry, the right of asylum, and any support would have to be denied to purely economic refugees, but rigorously and without exception, there must also take place a return, that is to say, a repatriation back to their homeland. This on the one hand, whilst finally establishing a multinational peacefighting troop on the other hand, and it must be ensured in the dictatorial home countries of the economic refugees, that the dictatorships are abolished and replaced by true democracies, and with this healthy state regulations would also be created, with all the trimmings, through which the living conditions could also improve in the country to the benefit of all human beings. This coupled with the fact that in these countries through appropriate and humanely correct measures, also the economic refugee problem would be prevented. And concerning this, which relates to the homelands of the economic refugees, must equally apply also to the transit countries, through which the economic refugees are smuggled. Thus also likewise by necessity in this respect, would be the use of a peace-fighting troop of multinational form, as well as with regard to a monitoring of all the sea areas, so that no further flows of economic refugees can be put to sea. And by the same token, the multinational peace-fighting troops should also see to it that the people smugglers and human traffickers would be fought everywhere, brought to a standstill, and the fallible ones severely punished, which only by a lifelong deportation into an area of banishment would be right. All these factors, however, will be considered neither by the leaders of the industrialized countries, particularly by the EU dictatorship and by their representatives, nor by public offices, wrong aid organizations, political parties, and by all erroneous humanists, because on the one hand it all does not matter to them. They are hypocritical ones and not directly personally affected by everything. And on the other, because they indulge in an erroneous humanism that makes them blind to the reality and its truth. And with regard to the erroneous humanists, it is to be directly said that as a result of an erroneous and hypocritical understanding of humaneness, they do not see the reality and its truth, and indeed very often therefore, because they are blinded by false religious and sectarian irrational teachings, and everything is looked at and considered from a religious sectarian euphoric view and belief, that they do something good with their wrong humanism on the one hand and on the other, would act divinely, or in the sense of Jesus Christ, or according to a real love for the next one. That they, however, with that only further promote the whole misery and propel it higher and higher instead of ending it. They lose no thoughts over this, and therefore indeed not, because with regard to the wrong humanism, they are suggestively blinded by the whisperings of the religions and sects, so that they are not able to recognize, let alone to understand, the reality and its truth. So the whole misery goes on and increases more and more. And for this, in Europe especially, the responsible ones are the leaders of the EU dictatorship, as well as their representatives, and the actual erroneous humanists, from among the people as well as the erroneous aid organizations of the Christian religion and its sects. All these are the ones who wrap themselves in a fraudulent halo and reject all the necessary rigorous measures and believe know-it-alls as well as megalomaniacs that they could resolve the terrible things through wrong humanistic measures, although they are so foolish and asinine that they could neither recognize the effective reality nor its truth, and also not understand that they only make everything even worse with what they decide upon and do. They believe that if they knock one head off the Hydra economic refugee serpent, that they would thus also destroy the other problems. But this is a hugely erroneous belief, because the economic refugee problem is like the Lernaean Hydra, that is to say, the gigantic Hydra serpent of Greek mythology, which was endowed with 9 heads and lived in the swamps of Lerna. When a head was knocked off of it, then for each one, it subsequently grew 2 new ones, and the main head, that is to say the 9th head, was even immortal. Only if the decapitation wound of a knocked-off head was cauterized with fire could it be prevented that 2 new heads formed. Only in this way was it possible that even the immortal head fell off and the Hydra perished. Just in the same wise, it is possible that an end can be prepared to the rampant and continuous disaster of the refugees increasing with no limit, and everything normalizes itself again, because only in this way, rigorously severing head by head, as well as the main head of the refugee Hydra, and that the wounds are fully cauterized, can an end to the whole thing be prepared, and once again a healthy normal state brought about. However, the rulers and their deputies prevent precisely that, and namely by only wanting to fight against symptoms, such as through the imbecility that increasingly sea rescue boats should be sent out into the Mediterranean to pick up and to rescue refugees who have fallen into distress at sea. For this reason, immensely more money should be made available by the EU dictatorship, and of course, most notably, Angela Merkel beats the drum for this, the ignorant, foolish EU dictator, and is of the brain-dead opinion that thereby a problem would be solved. And what is otherwise once again to be clearly said, the entirety of the economic refugee problem has nothing to do with those refugees whose lives are threatened in their homelands by religious, sectarian, and political terror as well as by acts of war and so on, which is why for the safety of their lives, they will flee and must seek refuge and asylum in other countries. With regard to such refugees, it is a duty as a human being that they are helped in every necessary wise and protection is granted to them. But even such refugees can afford an escape, only if they have enough money, just at least as much as they need for the escape. Namely, if the human beings are poor as a mouse, then they cannot flee into a prosperous industrialized country, but only in a neighboring country, where they miserably vegetate away in refugee camps. And these refugees are the ones who need the help most of all and who, worthy of life, need to be supplied with all necessary goods and medicines through fair aid organizations from the wealthy industrialized countries. And in truth, this urgently needed help is lacking everywhere, and indeed not least because too little money is there, because the aid organizations usually themselves pocket 40% of their collected funds to cover their expenses, etc. Therefore not a voluntary, but rather only a paid assistance is provided, and precisely an inadequate one at that. And if certain countries, such as Switzerland, hypocritically take such refugees into its country for political reasons and for the sake of image cultivation, then this happens only through a really tough selection, and also in a wise that not the poorest, rather only refugees are chosen who have a certain status and who can stand in a good light and are able to promote themselves during the selecting. I see the whole thing like this, and there is yet a lot more to say, because many factors still have not been addressed.
Contact Report 629,
Well, in my opinion, the matter with the hundreds of thousands of refugees has escalated into a drama and even an ongoing tragedy, causing unforeseen and huge problems. As I have already said in other conversations and also stated in articles, the main blame for this lies with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel. The latter was crazy enough to sound the sound of a mad drum that all refugees from all dictatorial and war-laden countries were welcome in Germany and in the EU dictatorship, and would receive decent help. This welcome invitation went of course like a lightning-fast wildfire on tour, both to civil war-ravaged Syria, which was infested by Islamist terror, and also to Iraq, other Arab states, and African countries. The Chancellor's bigoted and unrealistic nonsense was inevitably understood by hundreds of thousands of people as an invitation to leave their homeland as refugees and to make their way to Germany, Sweden, and other countries of the EU dictatorship. This, whereby many can only be judged by the term economic refugees and wealthy refugees, who also had and have enough money to finance their flight to the European dictatorship empire. And it is these refugees who cowardly leave their homeland and abandon it, instead of doing something to create peace and also something economically in their homeland, so that a life there becomes possible. And these refugees are usually the ones who go to the rich industrial countries of Europe, to the EU dictatorship and also to the USA, to hold out their hands, to the aid money that has to be paid by the hard-working people of the well-off states, namely by the horrendous taxes branched off by the powerful states, which have to be paid by the hard-working citizens, and very often are uselessly squandered by stupid government machinations. But the whole thing of the refugee tragedy has still many other bad consequences, because both the effectively correct refugees, who flee from their homeland, because they are threatened of life and their existence and security, and who must very well be helped in human duty, and the well-off economic and prosperity refugees must be fed and medically cared for. All of them, whether real refugees or profiteer refugees fleeing only from their home countries to hold out their open hands in the affluent states of Europe and the USA, etc., into which golden fruits should fall without having to do any work, cannot of course live and sleep on the streets without asylum legislation. Nor can they simply be exposed to starvation in the refugee states for reasons of humanity alone, so they inevitably have to be fed, which costs billions for hundreds of thousands of refugees. Consequently, they must be cared for in every possible way, and also housed in dwellings, just as medical and hygienic aid must be provided to them, all of which costs millions and billions of dollars, and thus enormous sums of money, which must be raised by the hard-working taxpayers of the countries of refuge. All kinds of care personnel are also needed, and they are indispensable for the true and false refugees, as well as for the housing contacts, dwellings, housing estates, and various other buildings of some kind, which must be made available in order to give the true and false refugees a roof over their heads. But all such existing, empty and made available accommodation possibilities do not suffice any longer. Consequently, by the authorities and governments as well as various organizations etc. to the drastic measure of the inevitable seizure of all possible premises is seized, which will lead in the long run up to the expropriation of private dwellings and real estates, if the ever more horrendous rising refugee nature is not stopped by a reasonable fight against the causes in the refugee countries, and a stop is pushed forward. What is currently happening with the refugee flows in Europe and will spread to the whole world in the future has little to do with flight for reasons of threatened life, in the true sense of the word, because a large proportion of the refugees cannot be called real refugees because they shamefully abandon their homeland only for reasons of economic profit, in order to live better in luxury in Europe or the USA, and to become wealthy. That this crazy idea, which has spread like wildfire not only in the Occident and the whole of the West, but as far as the Orient and the Orient, as well as to Africa, Asia, and South America, through the nonsense of Angela Merkel's invitation to refugees, and which really makes life-threatening refugees come to Europe, was foreseeable for the rational. But since Merkel, who suffers from reality falsity naivety, but also lacks clear understanding and reason as a result, was not able to judge the consequences of her idiotic speeches, precisely the resulting refugee tragedy and its far-reaching consequences, today the whole of Europe is under the refugee foxtail. But the problem is not those refugees who flee their homeland and come to Europe as a result of danger to their lives, but the hundreds of thousands of economic refugees who have been attracted by Merkel's bullshit and will continue to flow into Europe, because they are truly no refugees, but effective refugee tourists who engage in refugee tourism. Their ideas, which they have with regard to quickly achieving great prosperity in Europe, especially in Germany and in the EU dictatorship, and being fed by the EU dictatorship population with clothes, cars, and all kinds of luxury and financial aid, have the enormous catch of the fact that this will in no way be the case, because in the end, the authorities and governments, and also the people from the populations who are still helpful today, will have to clamp down everything in this respect. Of course, help cannot be provided endlessly, because every state, including all countries of the EU dictatorship, pushes not only financially, but also in every respect, to its limits, and must ultimately capitulate to the streams of refugees and the demands of the refugees. Ultimately, it is inevitable that the whole thing will lead to the collapse of social peace in all the countries flooded by refugees, which will be the case in the future worldwide, when 300 to 350 million people around the world will be fleeing, which will inevitably be the case in the future due to man-made climate change and horrendous overpopulation. The growing world population will have less and less room to live and to be together. Consequently, people will step on each other's feet, become more and more indifferent to each other, and begin to hate and harass each other more and more. But it will be even more, and everything will get much worse, because that will bring with it the refugee tragedy fueled in Europe by Angela Merkel and all her submissive state officials, as well as climate change, and the coming natural disasters of all kinds. But it will also be the general unpeacefulness of the masses of mankind, as well as the free restriction of men through the violence of the authorities, military, governments, and security forces. Consequently, the general freedom of men will be more and more curtailed, and they will be supervised in a totalitarian way and brought absolutely under control. Totalitarian control by the authorities, the military, the state, and the security forces in this respect will be a welcome in the future, although the first loops have already been designed and are in operation for this purpose, in which the people of all nations have already become entangled today by these forces and are restricted in their actual freedom, as well as in some fundamental rights. The streams of refugees, and this is another problem, consist of people from different social strata, mentalities, and religions, and it is precisely this that causes discord among them, as well as hatred and envy, which inevitably leads to violence and quarrels, as well as theft, murder and manslaughter, and to betrayal, slander, and rape among the refugees. But even in these situations, the right thing is not being done to avoid everything, because it is simply impossible for security forces to keep such masses of people, such as refugees, under control in every necessary way. Nor is it done what would be necessary, and would consist in the need to combat the causes of flight in the countries of origin or flight. Just like every dictatorship and every terror of war and terror, as well as the lame and underdeveloped economy, this is not talked of in any government in the world, not even of Merkel and all her subservient government trolls in the EU dictatorship. So in the refugee countries, the causes of flight, such as dictatorship, terrorism, civil war, oppression, abuse of laws, and persecution, are not fought against and not completely eradicated, just as the ailing economy is neither ended nor flourished. The fact that in all countries the forms of authorities and government would have to be transformed into pure and direct democracies, and that effective freedom, peace, and just correct and humanly justifiable legislation would have to be established and guaranteed, which would apply equally to all citizens of the respective state, without distinction between the rich and the poor. Government officials and state employees, etc., also remains for the time being only an illusion, because all those responsible for the state all over the world have neither a brilliant idea nor the will to do so. And there is even less consideration of the need to create a multinational peace struggle force to create peace, freedom, and order throughout the world. However, this can only be possible through such a multinational force that acts uniformly worldwide and is suzerain-led and commanded by an authoritative, peaceful, rational, powerless, logically thinking, and intentionally forward-looking world body. Only through such a multinational peace struggle force can it happen that all dictatorships and terrorist organizations, as well as all power-hungry state powers, criminal organizations can be effectively and definitively fought against and dissolved. But this can only happen if a multinational force takes up the fight against all evil in a uniform and just manner, and conducts every fight in such a way that peace, freedom, and harmony come to rule, as well as that all human rights are respected, and that illogical violence, criminality, delusion, sectarianism, and crime, terrorism, and war of all kinds are rendered completely null and void. Also, on the one hand, the ever more rapidly growing overpopulation must be stopped by a worldwide birth ban and by state-controlled birth control, and on the other hand, all catastrophic effects and degenerations in relation to human machinations with regard to climate, nature, and its fauna and flora must be finally stopped.
Contact Report 653.
From the mid-1980s onwards, the economic boom will collapse worldwide, bringing enormous and unprecedented unemployment and much misery and hardship, as well as a cold and indifferent lack of relationships among human beings. However, this will also cause crime and terrorism to rise sharply, with criminal and felonious gangs from poor countries also spreading into the industrialized countries in Europe, committing burglaries, fraud, and theft, and not even shying away from murder. The banks will ruin themselves through greed and ignorance. Just as many countries will become massively indebted, because the governments will squander the financial resources they collect from their people as taxes, and will increase these taxes by all kinds of finesse, and also impose taxes on more and more things, foodstuffs and goods.
Contact Report 655.
To help honestly and in the correct way has always been a pleasure to me. But tell me, my friend, what do you think of my thoughts that for economic and other reasons of prosperity, so-called economic refugees should never be offered a hand? Consequently, they should also not be recognized as refugees in the right of asylum. If it is only a matter of being able to lead a prosperous life in a better-off country, it cannot and must not be a human right to flee one's homeland. But a flight can effectively only be when compelling life-threatening reasons and circumstances justify a flight from one's homeland. In this context, what is effectively meant is a cowardly flight from one's ancestral homeland, but not a correct and lawfully officially approved and executed emigration, a transfer or resettlement to another country with all the necessary identity papers, etc., in order to pursue regular work in another country, to lead a righteous life, and to assimilate into the local customs, language, and civic duties. The human rights situation allows this in practically all countries for every upright human being who is not persecuted in his home country as a result of criminal or criminal acts and deeds, and who also fulfills his civic duties. This does not apply to work shirkers, criminals, terrorists, criminals, and effective economic refugees who are not welcome anywhere. As a rule, a human being who emigrates for reasons of rights is not a refugee from his homeland, because only a human being who has to flee from his homeland because of unjustified persecution, or because of a real threat to his life or danger to his life, and has to seek asylum and protection in another state, offering him freedom for the sake of his life, is considered an effective refugee. Basically, a distinction must be made between real refugees and so-called pseudo-refugees, such as poverty refugees who flee their homeland because of their poverty, which very often also has political reasons, which, however, does not justify flight, as well as the pure profit refugees, economic refugees, and prosperity refugees, who only want to profit from the prosperity of other countries and live in joys and glory, often at the expense of the working population of the prosperous countries. This alone is proven by the fact that such refugees are supported by the state in the countries of refuge with immense funds, expensive accommodation and materials, etc., while the poor among their own population have to live miserably below the subsistence level and receive much less in terms of state care and protection than the real and fake refugees.
So in the European Christian world, not only xenophobia, racial hatred, and religious hatred go hand in hand with faith, but also hatred of native fellow human beings and neighbors, or even one's own family members, and so on. The whole thing is also taking on worse and worse forms, especially because more and more growing economic hardships are appearing, which are being nourished by Earth humans in Europe becoming more and more addicted to money, pleasure, and wealth, but not being sufficiently rewarded according to their views and their egoistic needs, while their employers and superiors are becoming millionaires many times over through horrendous and widely exaggerated rewards. The whole thing leads to popular discontent and to degenerations in the behavior of the populations, as a result of which many kinds of murders take place and discord and all kinds of malicious acts and deeds lead to mischief, as a result of which even exploitation, assassinations, theft, fraud, trafficking in human beings, prostitution, robbery and suicide attacks, etc., appear.
Contact Report 656.
However, the populations of many of these countries, particularly throughout Europe, the United States and Canada, will also incur financial debts on a private basis, which will make them unable to meet their financial obligations, as will the national budgets of many countries, which are no longer able to cope with their debts. The whole thing leads to serious economic collapses and to the dissolution and bankruptcy of long-established banks, companies and corporations managed over long decades of rights, as well as to years of public finance problems and constant changes of government as a result of incapable rulers. And to come back to the private sphere, as I said before, large financial debts arise because a senseless and uncontrollable squandering of money for many unnecessary things in the populations will spread far and wide, and even cause family needs and family destruction, as well as serious criminal acts and deeds. The emerging and rapidly developing economic upswing will rapidly increase the wages of workers and also drive the general standard of living into higher forms, which will tempt people to incur ever greater financial expenditures and debts that they cannot afford in terms of wage income. For you, your family, the working and mission group and their individual members, as well as for a center that you will build with the help of your faithful gathered around you in a known place, on a not far elevated place near the birthplace of your mother according to your ideas, you will then continue your efforts to familiarize yourself with a large financial budget. And in this regard, you will voluntarily take responsibility and administration for the community you form as an association, and whose members you will also advise and assist. But the future of the financial economy will be difficult, because from 1988 onwards, the whole world will be even gloomier in terms of money, because then the foundation of a capital power will take place in the USA, which will intervene as a worldwide shadow bank and world shadow government in the entire world, finance and control many countries and their structures. In the United States itself, this capital power will develop into an internal shadow government which, secretly for the people of the United States, will govern the United States of America at its own will, as will another U.S. shadow government, which has existed for a long time, and will continue to exist for a long time to come. The new capital power that will be established in 1988, as I have already explained, will build a worldwide capital network in a short time, which will not only dominate the financial world of banks, but also politics, various states, and the economies of many countries according to the power structures of this world shadow government. With regard to these things, you have to learn a lot, so also use many facts, which I have already told you, and will continue to tell you, to write fact-pointing and warning letters concerning the dangerous and unpeaceful coming world events. But you shall also name the threatening, disastrous machinations of the overpopulation which destroy nature, the waters and the climate, which degenerate and which infiltrate the natural, which will lead to very serious natural catastrophes similar to those of the primal world, if all the future threatening and degenerating machinations of the overpopulation, which continues to develop very rapidly, are not stopped. But now I will first explain what the beginning or origin of very many, in the next 5.5 decades, will be in terms of hopeless things, factors, and terrible events, which will also take place far into the third millennium. Through the guilt of the political, military, economic, scientific, world domination addicted and criminal machinations of the USA already next year, a lot of inhuman evil will arise worldwide, and a lot of misfortune will take its beginning. And through the criminal actions of the USA, terrorism also arises in many places, as well as the destruction of the livelihoods of millions of people by food companies, and, as a result of the depletion of Earth resources, the destruction of nature and catastrophes. Nevertheless, with the end of last year's World War, no phase of global peace was created, but a state of Cold War, which will become a determining factor for future political, military, and economic development, and which will in various ways degenerate into a nuclear war. As a result of the inability of the USA and the Soviet Union, which have been hostile to each other for a long time as major powers, and as the only of all the states involved in the last World War, they pursue different military and political interests. As a rule, American demands were and are made to the USSR, which are advantageous only for the USA. All this will have adverse political, military, and economic, as well as many other bad consequences in all countries, where the military, politics, and economy of the USA nest, and all this will lead to insurrections, anarchism, riots, civil wars, xenophobia, and racial hatred, as well as to anarchistic, deadly, and criminal political groups, which will indulge their delusions by murdering them. But also worldwide terror organizations will emerge, whose fanatical founders will be trained by military etc. of the USA to fighters, who then gather like-minded people around themselves and carry out bloody religious political fights into the whole world, and mercilessly torture and murder countless other believers and innocent people bestially. However, as I have already explained in earlier statements, in the coming times and well into the third millennium, Secret Service, military, criminal, warlike and even terrorist, subversive, political and economic machinations emerging in foreign countries by the USA will cause many state systems to collapse and lead to civil wars and terrorist wars, resulting in large streams of refugees and flight-like migrations of peoples. So a very unpleasant and far-reaching terrorism will develop, as well as an unstoppable refugee system until the distant future. Over time, this will result in extensive streams of refugees that will spread all over the world, and in 70 years will comprise around 70 million refugees, whereby in the second decade of the new or third millennium, an irresponsibly naive and sick woman in power in Germany will do all she can to ensure that millions of refugees will flow into Europe from politically and economically underdeveloped and insecure countries burdened by war and terrorism. Many of them will be real refugees and refugees at risk of their lives only by name, because a large number of others will flee their homeland at that distant time only for economic, criminal, and terrorist reasons, in order to profit in the countries of refuge and to act criminal. But they will also be degenerates in religious sectarian aberrations who pretend to be refugees in need, in order to arrive as terrorists in countries of refuge in which other religions and sects predominate, in order to spread death, disaster, and destruction there above all among the innocent people of other faiths who are uninvolved in war and terror. However, the majority of those in power, and those responsible for refugee immigration, will be largely incapable of dealing logically and reasonably with the emergence of the problems that arise, for they will make wrong and inadequate decisions, and will take and adopt measures that will be useless, and will allow the evils to continue. This will mean that the problems and difficulties of handling the masses of refugees, and what is to be done about them, will be all the more exacerbated and make the necessary solutions more difficult. As a result of hardship and misery in Africa, war and terrorism in Asia, the Middle East, and the Orient, waves of refugees actually threatening the lives of refugees will also flood many terrorists, shy workers, elements seeking only prosperity, multifaceted criminals throughout Europe. And the real origin of these coming streams of refugees and migrations of peoples will be, on the one hand, the inexorably increasing overpopulation, by which unemployment, uprisings, poverty, hunger, diseases, wars, xenophobia, racial and religious hatred, terrorism, epidemics, lack of water, and many other factors will become insoluble problems. On the other hand, however, the USA's desire for world power will also contribute to this, through which serious criminal, political, secret service, military and economic interventions will take place in the various structures of the Asian and other Eastern, as well as Arab and Oriental states, and an enormous amount of disaster, suffering, misery, as well as discord and terrorism will be created.
Contact Report 658.
The absence of these livestock means that the barren soils can no longer be worked, goods can no longer be transported, and natural food can no longer be grown and harvested, which naturally means that famine is on the rise in some of the countries affected. But also fruits, vegetables, ivory and horn of the rhinoceroses, and in Asia also organs of tigers, etc., are profit-greedy, irresponsibly delivered to China, as well as to the USA and Europe by state authorities and criminal business people in foreign states, like especially Africa, South America, and Asia. This, while the local workers are treated like slaves by their exploitative, profit-seeking employers, as well as by many global corporations, and are processed with paltry salaries. Also, China acts in the same way and infiltrates the rights of the natives of the foreign states and robs them of their food and their otherwise already very low prosperity, if such a food exists at all, in order to solve its own food and other problems, which are no longer possible to solve in its own country. So China is conscientiously and criminally robbing the entire infrastructure of other states, destroying the agronomic, economic, and resource forms of infrastructure. So in this respect, China is engaged in evil reconstruction and destruction, instead of being careful to radically stop the growth of the overpopulation in a humane way by hard birth control, which would also result in a rapid reduction through natural deaths. With regard to the use of huge land areas and industry in foreign states by China, the demand for goods and commodities for the cosmetics, pharmaceutical and metal industries, and for meat and fish is also covered, with all kinds of animals and animals being slaughtered and the foreign states sinking into misery and misery. These countries are, on the one hand, irresponsibly and contractually bartered to China by criminal rulers and politicians, who manage to make a profit in their own pockets, and on the other hand, they become more and more impoverished and have to export their extremely laboriously produced meager food and raw materials of all kinds to China, thereby starving themselves and perishing miserably. The consciencelessness and greed for profit of the responsible statesmen and politicians of the foreign states destroys the entire economy and all prerequisites for the valuable development of the countries concerned. All these states are thus exploited on the one hand by their own powerful statesmen and on the other by China. And since China's population is growing uncontrollably at great speed, it needs more and more resources, country products and food from foreign states, whose irresponsible rulers sell everything to China, which just as unscrupulously buys everything up and exploits the foreign states to the point of complete miserable collapse and destruction, just as Swiss and other European, as well as U.S. food companies and all sorts of other large companies do in a criminal way.
Contact Report 661.
This could then provoke a Fourth World War, by which, if Russia were defeated, the USA and the EU dictatorship would make many annexations of states, and the USA could satisfy its greed for world domination, and the EU dictatorship could satisfy its desire to accumulate states. such a Fourth World War, during which China, England, Canada, most of Africa and South America, Australia, and various other states, including Switzerland, would also be forced to act, would mean that further and additional catastrophic climate destruction would be caused. Ultimately, however, enormous destruction of Earth's surface and nature, as well as of fauna and flora, and a tremendous amount of human achievements would be destroyed, many areas depopulated, and many land areas infertile and uninhabitable would be unpredictable. This would fulfill the last predicted catastrophe, which has been threatening since time immemorial, predicted 2/3 extermination of earthly world population. But there would also be the possibility that U.S. America, as well as the EU dictatorship, with its planned armies, would only involve Russia in their power mania, and possibly only a few with this ally, and would wage war on it, in order to realize the incorporation of the EU dictatorship states into Europe and Eurasia in the event of a victory. And if the USA were also involved, then they too could realize their world domination plans. And the fact that since time immemorial the effective facts of U.S. world domination have been geared to this is undoubtedly certain. This, of course, is connected with the criminal activities of the secret services, political activities, war crimes, and even criminal economic activities that have cost many millions of lives to date. A fact, however, which is not recognized worldwide, especially by the entire leadership and supporters of the EU dictatorship, as well as by the entire global supporters of the U.S.-America world population, which is based on their stupidity and incompetence, because reality and truth are not recognized. And all those citizens of the USA, on the other hand, have no chance to do anything that is righteous and disagrees with the whole of the American world domination addiction and all of the inhuman machinations of the USA, because they simply have to keep quiet and make a good face of it, as is the case with the EU dictatorship. They are, like the proponents of U.S. America and EU dictatorship in Switzerland and in the EU dictatorship itself, which I also want to cite, not capable of a clear mindfulness, attention, consideration, and the real perception of the effective reality and its truth. And this is because on the one hand they are impaired in their intelligence, and on the other hand they are also unable to recognize, consider, and judge clearly given facts logically. Their cognition, or their conscious perception of reality and its truth, is very limited and therefore extremely deficient, because their conscious and cognitive inertia prevents them from perceiving the signals from the environment and consequently from processing the effective facts. Billy, cognitive derives from the Latin cognoscere, which can be translated as to recognize. In fact, it has to be said that they are fools who believe in fools, who bewitch and mislead them, and can therefore be said, fools believe fools and fools lead fools. But when it comes to the machinations of the USA, which have since ancient times been intended to lead to the realization of their craving for world domination, it is absolutely certain that these violate all defined human rights and laws of war. Fundamentally, the whole thing is controlled by U.S. America through actions that are murderous, by secret service, military, acts of war crimes, criminal and unconstitutional, political, world community damaging, economic, whereby the criminal and felonious machinations of the USA are hyped up worldwide by many irresponsible media.
Contact Report 668.
In this sense, President Trump would then be the icing on the cake that is necessary to lead Earth and its humanity into a good, progressive, and peaceful future. And if Trump sticks to his words and promises and does not allow himself to be influenced by his adversaries, then what you wrote as a poem on Saturday, July 7th, 1949, when my father predicted to you that the USSR would be dissolved in 1991 and renamed Russia, will also be fulfilled. He also explained to you that the new German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, who was elected after the World War in 1945, was the originator of a basic idea for European unification with the slogan, "Europe must be created." His idea was based on the fact that an economic interdependence of the European states must be created, which on the one hand should lead to a political agreement, and on the other hand should also prevent wars.
Contact Report 670.
In 1971, a so-called World Economic Forum, OIF, will then be set up as a foundation in the Swiss canton of Geneva, and already, after considerable time, will cause a lot of turmoil and anger among the people. In this forum, leading international economists, politicians, intellectuals, and journalists will meet to discuss current global economic, health, and environmental policy issues and to initiate a comprehensive globalization. This will not be harmless, because due to the globalization which will be striven for and achieved, worldwide, life forms of all species and kinds will be carried off into other countries in a few years, displacing and eradicating indigenous forms of life. These will be the amphibians, fish, mammals, insects, animals and other creatures, plants, reptiles and birds of various species and kinds. But then, through globalization, also various illnesses and rampantly spreading diseases will be transmitted and start to spread worldwide as epidemics, endemic infection and pandemics. Note Billy. Epidemics are regional or area-specific. A pandemic is global. The earth will break up in some parts, and England as well as a large part of Japan will be devoured by the sea, whereby also the northern part of Europe will profoundly change and become uninhabitable. Thus altogether a new regulation of the planet will establish itself, and a purification will take place in the high governments and the offices below them, because the people will stand up against them and will demand that they be given greater consideration, and that the individual human beings and their concerns are taken seriously. There through and through other specific circumstances, political, economic, and other conditions will appear, which will lead thereto that among the human beings a better equality, and a greater understanding for and among each other, as well as for the requirements of the individual human being are striven for. From the 1980s onwards, there will be a worldwide unemployment which will continue for decades until far into the new millennium and will bring a lot of hardship, misery, and crime. Likewise, also inflation as well as much private, family, state, and corporate indebtedness, through which companies, private individuals, families, and countries become illiquid, bankrupt, and banks also become bankrupt. This will be linked to the fact that trade unions will increasingly and more often organize workers' strikes, thereby calling on employers to pay ever higher wages to the workers. The higher wages will result in a higher standard of living, and it will also happen that foodstuffs and the entire cost of living and all goods of every kind become ever more expensive and become unaffordable for poorer human beings. It will also be the time when young people in the civilized, industrialized countries are rapidly and severely falling into demoralization and a poverty of intelligence, have no control over their thoughts and feelings any longer, fall into severe psychological and reactive psychoses, whereby they also suffer from and fall ill with depression and symptoms of schizophrenia, as well as mania, anxiety disorders, and other psychotic problems. This will spread more and more in the new millennium, which is why it will be necessary for you to write a book about that, which will be a great help to all those who will then strive to study your book. Worldwide, the value of money will fall very low, which will be the case especially in Europe through the introduction of a dictatorship union currency. This currency will drive some member countries of the dictatorship union into unimagined horrendous debt, which is to be compensated for by further financial indebtedness. Thus, national bankruptcy will emerge as a result of national mismanagement, whereas in other countries, this can be prevented in many cases only by governmental financial aid. The same will happen in the case of various large banks which, through megalomaniacal and economically inexpert people, will practice financial mismanagement, and will continue to exist only through financial federal subsidies. All these happenings cannot remain without consequences because the peoples will rise up and, under certain circumstances, start revolutions. And if then, the slimy domestic political machinations of the dictatorship union continue to be transformed into foreign policy machinations, and the smear campaign against Russia intensifies, then that could lead eventually to Russia being provoked into an armed conflict against the dictatorship union in Europe and the USA. If this were to prove true according to an old prophecy, then the European dictatorship union would rather be free of its dictatorship than disband as a result of instability and quarrels among the member countries. All over the world from then on there will be unpeace, which will often lead back to the USA-triggered, irresponsible Secret Service intrigues, manipulations, and military-armed conflicts and wars. This, in addition to the fact that, in many countries, governments will be overthrown internally, with the use of weapons, and power struggles of rival groups will take place, as a result of which increasingly hostile armed conflicts will take place all over the world, often continuing over several decades. It will emerge that new misregulation occurs in the systems of government within various countries, which means that the populations are constantly bombarded with new taxes because the persons responsible, the financial leaders in the governments and those who have the might themselves, do not know how to handle their finances and thereby drive their countries into horrendous debt, for which the taxpayers are then made liable with tax increases. But the time will come when human beings from the populace will occupy government offices, and a purification will be carried out at higher and lower government and office positions, whereby greater attention will be given to the welfare of the populace, and also consideration given to the individual human being. This will also result in certain circumstances and changes in political, economic, and all other conditions, and through that, equality between the two sexes will also come about, as well as a broader understanding of the really essential requirements of the individual human being. In the process, interpersonal relations obtain validity again, which over the next decades and into the new millennium will very quickly stagnate, through which human beings become stunted and lose the value of being human from their sense, as well as the true meaning of love, whereby they become cold and unconcerned in their thoughts and feelings, and thereby obtuse in regard to their fellow human beings and their problems.
Contact Report 673.
That was never and is also not important for me today. Furthermore, I have a wide back, over which everything can run off like unclean water. Moreover, all those journalists of both sexes, as well as all adversaries of all kinds, pillory themselves in public with their lies, slander, and stupid claims and words. But you know that, so we don't have to talk about it much. But what we should lose a word about refers to the First World War of 1756 to 1763, which we have only been talking about as such for about 2 years, but which we have never openly mentioned before. For this purpose I was asked by telephone as follows.
Question. For some time now you have been saying that there had already been 3 world wars, with the First World War being waged in the years 1756, 1763. Why has he never been mentioned before by you? And why is the public concealed the knowledge that 3 world wars have already shaken the world? Berchtold, Switzerland.
I know about the reasons why the First World War is not declared as such, but as a 7 Years' War, and that the USA was actually the originator of this world war, although they were founded only years after the end of the war, namely after the War of Independence, the North American War, the American Revolution of 1776-1783. A war between the 13 British colonies on the east coast of North America and the mother country Great Britain. Only after its end did the new independent state, the USA or the United States of America, be founded. The 7 Years' War of 1756-1763 was also waged in Europe, while at the same time the British-French colonial war raged in North America, which led to the withdrawal of the French from North America, as well as to the assumption of rule by Great Britain. Through its colonization, this had become a political and economic power, initially in the Western Hemisphere, but also on the oceans. King George III, who knew nothing better in his greed for power than to make the crisis that existed between Great Britain and the American colonies even greater and more extensive, which drove the then evil political situation, which showed hardly any stability, even more into more awkward situations. This king was only big-mouthed and furthermore absolutely incapable to create a clear goal and to strive for such a goal. So far, but I don't know the reason why it was not possible to mention openly at an earlier time what, according to your statements, actually happened at that time, and why there was already a forerunner of the USA before the foundation of the USA who was guilty for the First World War of 1756-1763. If you can please explain about this, perhaps also what the previous machinations were about in relation to the First World War, whereby the first U.S. President George Washington was a driving force behind a conspiracy.
To do the whole thing in detail would be too much to ask, which is why I will only briefly mention the most important thing. And where the name America comes from, there the Wikipedia excerpt gives information. As far as the emergence of the USA is concerned, you have already anticipated a number of things in an explanatory manner, including the conspiracy that has been concealed in every respect since its inception and has never been made public, nor in the colonial circles of Great Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal, nor among the Aborigines, the various Indian tribes. And that has remained so to this day. But as far as the conspiracy and all the circumstances are concerned, I can explain the most important thing in this regard from my father's notes, just as he observed everything and recorded it in his annals. The conspiracy was staged by the slave owner Augustine Washington, born in Great Britain in 1693 and deceased in 1743, the father of the later first President of America, George Washington. The conspirators counted several thousand colonists, who secretly called themselves Americans in their circles, and who strove to establish their own form of government, which, however, was kept secret from the outside under threat of death, which is why nothing in writing was ever recorded, and nothing was ever written to the outside, so that the whole thing could always be kept secret, even to this day. In 1732, his son George Washington was born, who then became the first President of the United States of America and died in 1799. Early on, he was involved in the conspiracy of his father, to whom he was completely addicted, following with his followers also the goal of his own American state formation, and did not omit anything to achieve this goal one day. Although he lacked a good school education, as well as a valuable general education, because he was very uneducated, unread, and ignorant, which he could later improve with the help of a decisive woman. Overall, however, he was able to cover up the whole thing to a large extent, to which his origin as part of the economic and cultural elite of the slavery plantation owners of the state of Virginia came in very handy to him, because through his origin he also came into contact with a wealthy and influential and very cultivated nobleman named Lord William Fairfax, and won his trust and help. He also owned large estates in Great Britain.
Contact Report 683.
Whether the responsible, politicians and rulers as well as the entire Earth humans finally succeed in exercising their intellect and reason in order to curb population growth in the poor and poorer developing countries, as well as in the rich states, also depends on the intelligence and decisions of the politicians, rulers, and the entire Earth humans. Central to this is also the implementation of the resolutions of the Cairo World Population Conference of 1994, whereby the core points of the whole also include a qualitative and quantitative improvement of reproductive health care, including healthy and birth-regulating family planning, as well as the empowerment of women. That is to say, the strengthening of their legal, economic, and social position, their self-determination, equality, and equal rights in all things, including with regard to pay and all rights in general. It is also urgently necessary to strengthen the role of women in every respect, and to be mindful of the fact that women are not simply there to have children. Basically, they need to be properly educated about birth control, and consequently also be able to decide for themselves about their sexuality and contraception, and whether or not they want to bring offspring into the world at all, without any violent interference from a man. Global overpopulation has also brought and continues to bring about worldwide deforestation, with worldwide conversions of forest land to land uses for food and minerals, such as explosive engine fuels, taking place as a result of the excessive mass of humanity. According to the calculations of the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, forest loss is caused, among other things, by poverty and strong population growth in the affected regions. And this destruction of forest areas is often caused by so-called land grabbing. That is to say, by international investors who clear large areas of forest for plantations, also huge areas of rainforest, destroying the livelihoods of forest animals and other forest creatures, even human beings or indigenous peoples, and thus wiping out many life forms. In many poor African, South American, and Asian, as well as micro, poly, and Indonesian areas and countries, the forest cover has declined tremendously in a criminal manner over the last decades. The human beings there are for the most part farmers who work in a subsistence economy, or a demand economy, which corresponds to a basic economic strategy in which production primarily serves self-sufficiency without significant surpluses. In contrast to pure self-sufficiency, however, it also includes the bartering of one's own products on local markets. Due to the strong population growth, however, it was and is not possible for them to feed their families from the available arable land, which has led and will continue to lead to deforestation. However, the forest protected the land from soil erosion, which in the long term will result in a much greater loss of arable land. Since the concept of overpopulation exists both conceptually and in terms of content, that there are just globally far too many human beings, is judged by pathologically stupid, intelligent, unteachable, self-important, and egoistic people to be contemptuous of human beings, whereby they claim that laws from biology are inadmissibly transferred to the human social sphere. So the pathologically stupid and know-it-alls doubt that the Earth's carrying capacity is already exhausted, because in their stupidity they rather see everything solely in social, economic, and ecological problems, which they attribute solely to political and governmental failures, through which a poor distribution of the, allegedly, altogether sufficient resources comes about. It is true that political and governmental failures are very much to blame for many disasters that have affected and will continue to affect earthly humanity, but not in the way that the stupid and impudent accusations of the unintelligent claim. Nevertheless, the responsible politicians and rulers must be blamed for the rampant overpopulation, because in their self-importance, which also included stupidity and cowardice, the responsible politicians and rulers worldwide have not been able to teach the peoples that overpopulation means the downfall of humanity and the destruction of the planet as well as its fauna and flora, and that consequently a regulated birth stop and a following birth regulation must be introduced. The stupidity here is based on the laziness and indifference of not wanting to perceive the effective facts, which consist in the fact that through the destructive machinations caused by overpopulation on the planet, its nature and fauna and flora, the whole disaster of destruction is becoming more and more vicious and worse. This, then, while on the other hand the cowardice of politicians and rulers is founded in the fact that they are afraid of losing their offices and their might. Therefore all the destruction of the planet, of nature and its fauna and flora can continue.
Contact Report 688.
What can I say other than that you are right, and when I look at today's political military world situation, then I have to agree with you in particular, because in my opinion, it is much more dangerous than it was during the Cold War, only that this is trivialized to the outside world. And when I think about it, I also think that an unprecedented economic catastrophe is looming. So I think that there is a tense world situation, And I might say that the small and larger wars going on around the globe, the terror and all the political and military instability makes the world a powder keg that can blow up at any time. A situation is prevailing that is coming to a head more and more, whereby the whole thing worldwide clearly and generally corresponds to a chaos that is incomprehensible to the ordinary citizen, which is without a doubt being promoted in an underhanded and world domination greedy manner by the powerful in the USA, both by those in power and the secret services, whereby I would like to mention the CIA in particular, and also by the military. I would like to exclude Brazil, China, India, Russia, and South Africa, and the so-called SCO nations, or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization from this gigantic chaos that the USA is increasingly working up. As far as I know, these countries are still independent of the USA, and therefore still truly sovereign or self-determining. However, it cannot be that these countries are left alone and unmolested by the USA, because the USA, in its delusion of world domination and world police behavior, is effectively trying to bring great chaos into these countries as well. And they do this as usual, and since time immemorial, for example, by instigating insidious coup attempts in these countries, as was the case in Macedonia and Venezuela, among others. But the USA also does not shy away from speculative attacks, as was and is the case with China, where the USA is flirting with a later war. Russia, too, is a constant target of U.S. attacks, for the USA has repeatedly used the media to demonize this country, as it has done to other states. But even the financial reprisals by the IMF, also known as the International Monetary Fund, a specialized agency of the United Nations, whose headquarters is in Washington, D.C., USA are not stopped, as was the case, for example, with the central banks with regard to Greece and Brazil, or with regard to the sanctions against Persia, Iran, and Russia, as well as against North Korea, where the crazy dictator Kim Jong-un leads his bloody scepter. If we continue to look at the chaos that the USA is spreading worldwide, then this fact must also be related to Europe, specifically with regard to the fact that the EU dictatorship, as an ally, is being flooded with waves of refugees, whereby Germany in particular, or its population, is suffering from this, as are other EU dictatorship states. And it is an open secret that these refugee flows have been caused by the USA, but they have also been brought to Germany in particular by the refugee welcome culture of the incompetent and confused Chancellor Angela Merkel, because they come from countries in which so-called anti-terror wars are being waged, in which the USA is working in the front line and also in the background. And that large areas, villages, and cities have been destroyed in the process is well known, as is the fact that the ruins etc. serve as training grounds for the terrorist militias. The fact that these U.S. terrorist machinations correspond to alleged mistakes by the U.S. administration, as well as the fact that the U.S. is obviously losing control after its interventions, such as in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and in the near future also in Ukraine, is certainly no coincidence. Because when everything is looked at closely, I cannot get away from the thought that everything is deliberately and purposefully being done this way. And behind all this, I only see that the USA is perfidiously creating insecurity in the world, and deceitfully deceiving the peoples and states, and striving for, and wanting to realize its world domination addicted goals.
Contact Report 691.
What is particularly regrettable is that the righteous of those in power allow themselves to be condemned to silence and withhold their vote by these conscienceless and anti-people elements, who are elected to government through their populist machinations, or allow themselves to be influenced and persuaded to go along with such popular exploitative machinations. And this is an epidemic that has spread far and wide, and also throughout the entire extra-official and extra-state, and indeed practically in all private and economic sectors, such as in relation to the post office, doctors, hospitals, spy-techs and other care organizations, banks, dentists, companies and tradesmen, and so on. However, all this is not only criminal, but also criminal, because financially criminal, unscrupulous and money-grubbing elements get hold of ever more immense fortunes in every state-permitted way, set themselves high above the working class, dominate it, and run an uncontrollable criminal capitalism, to which the working class, respectively, the female and male effective laborers, must subordinate themselves and allow themselves to be exploited by the capital sharks. Of course, this is not understood by the entire working people and even by the entire population, as a result of which everything continues in this sad framework, and the entire working people become poorer and poorer, more and more underpaid and more exploited, and do not defend themselves against it, while the big capitalists and other millionaire creeps become richer and wealthier. In general, extremely complicated changes are already taking place in the whole world and will expand in the coming time, which will have governmental, political, capitalist, military, economic and civic implications caused by the behavior of incompetents in power, who, through wrong decisions, mismanagement, claims to power in other countries, suppression of freedom and peace in many respects in their own states, etc., will give rise to uprisings and revolts. Give reason for uprisings and revolts. 8. All over the world, states will again and again fall into turmoil because of civil and separatist unrest, which will lead to serious domestic and economic uprisings, riots and violence and turmoil. 13. The political risks are increasing more and more dramatically, as well as with regard to humanitarian concerns, economic problems, the entire national economy and companies, whereby there are also great dangers from wars and the international risk of terrorism, and thus security risks also play a major role. 18. Again and again, new enmities arise between various states, which lead to political and economic differences, and to evil and destructive wars and armaments, whereby a fourth world war must constantly be considered again and again. In this respect, the criminal world domination and world police errors and political machinations of the USA are particularly in the foreground as a driving force. 29. Speculators will cause a global financial and economic crisis, the like of which has never been seen before, as a result of which the entire financial economy will be in great distress, and there will also be much disaster and great shortages of economic goods. 30. Also in the USA, the population is to be expropriated as a result of the worldwide financial crisis, which will lead to vicious violence being used against the enraged and partly heavily armed population by military and police forces. 31. The planned ban on cash is intended to bring about the expropriation of the people, but the elite of the ruling class in capitalism will be able to swim in joy and glory. And the entire financial system of the whole world is to be overturned, in order to also reorganize all existing national debts of all countries, and in such a way that generally only the populations of the states are harmed. There are already secret plans in the USA and in the EU dictatorship to start a war against Russia from Germany, which is to be cited as the reason for the entire emerging world crisis. And it is clear from the outset that the blame for this war will be laid at the door of the Russians, of course completely unjustly, if it actually comes about. And if this war actually takes place, then martial law will be derived from it, which will suppress the enraged population, which will be completely dispossessed by strong and ruthless military and police forces.
This, however, will expand if in the entire political, economic, and general world events, as well as in the general overall behavior of Earth humans with regard to their intellect and reason, not everything changes decisively, and no progressive and logical behavior and actions arise which can guarantee a healthy continuation of Earth humans.
Such deadly criminal organizations have existed since time immemorial, and they continue to appear. But since the beginning of modern times in 1844, they have become more and more frequent and worse, also in terms of the techniques of torture, murder, killing, and violence. And since then, new techniques of all kinds have been used for this purpose. Some of these criminal organizations have worldwide networks and terrorize not only individual countries, but all earthly states, without it being possible to seriously oppose them due to their ramifications. For example, the religious sectarian political terrorist networks Al-Qaeda and the Islamist State, both of which, as a worldwide form of transnational terrorism, have large parts of the world in their sights, and want to force a change in the international economic or ruling order through vicious torture, violence, murder, manslaughter, and destruction.
Contact Report 692.
This whole public service activity is therefore not effectively aimed at guaranteeing the totality of all services and the basic supply of the population, because the entire restriction and the ever more blatant dismantling of the necessary branches, etc., in every respect, which can no longer be used by the population for their needs and necessities, make their lives and their quality of life more difficult overall, etc. And the reason why this is being done in such a way is not to make things easier for the people and to ensure better basic services, but to enable them to be misappropriated on the one hand and on the other hand to be financially exploited in an infamous way by the money-grubbing bigwigs and bosses who enrich themselves endlessly at the expense of the people. The whole thing is declared in a lying and fact-twisting manner with the term rationalization, which is explained in a literal paraphrase as making things more sensible, designing them expediently and streamlining them, whereby in the area of the economy and administration, and in the area of the workforce, the work processes are to be made more economical and efficient, reorganized, restructured, simplified, and standardized in order to increase performance and reduce expenditure by means of mechanization, automation, and division of labor, etc. This is the only way to achieve this. Through rationalization, costs are reduced. Of course, only for the firms and corporations and state enterprises, etc., that carry out the rationalization, which of course increases and boosts their profits and makes immense gains, while the wire pullers in the upper echelons pull their strings and then pocket undeserved rewards themselves, while the workers are fobbed off with low wages. In the case of the public service, this means that the population must effectively provide the totality of all services and their basic provision in the form of a public service itself, while the bigwigs, bosses, and the state administration, etc., etc., who are located at the top, collect and accumulate the big dough, while the population must do everything itself with regard to the totality of all services and their basic provision with effort and difficulty. This is just like the serfs of all those who thought up the allegedly relieving and beneficial public service, which in reality is a public service, through which the population is forced to walk very long distances as a result of the dismantling of all the necessary post offices, bus lines, bus stations, railway stations, shops and hospitals, etc. is forced to walk very long distances to be able to take care of their needs, because they are forced to do so by the public service, and have to handle, do, and take care of everything very laboriously themselves, whereby the companies and corporations, the state and the upper elite, profit horrendously. And this, while the prices in the entire food and other vital goods and commodities trade, etc., for everything, are outrageously and massively increased, while wages and pensions remain unchanged low or are set even lower, whereby especially financially underprivileged persons, especially old people without their own savings or with a mite already spent, can hardly afford the necessities of life anymore and are gnawing at the hunger cloth.
As you describe everything, the whole thing effectively has nothing to do with making life easier for the population. But on the contrary, it only benefits those who, as I want to say, pull the strings in the upper echelons and carry out the rationalization that benefits them, while the population is harmed in many ways.
Contact Report 697.
In this way, early and very secret precautionary plans already exist among the American government elite, which are to be carried forward into the future, when the still ongoing World War will be brought to an end by a gruesome murder and destruction scenario, with very dangerous bombing missions in Japan in the coming month of August, which, however, will trigger even much greater dangers of war, fear, and terror among the entire world population than has ever been the case before. This will continue into the third millennium, when the Soviet Union loses its communist power in almost 50 years, and then falls into economic decline and is transformed into a Russian Federation as a successor state of the Soviet Union. And this danger and the fear and terror of the whole of humanity of another global war will arise again in the third millennium through the fault of the United States of America, because they will also carry on the hostile agitation against the new Russia and incite and drive America-friendly countries to hostility towards Russia.
I know. Further this question. Do all Plejarans and the human beings of their federation undertake journeys through space? And what are the requirements for this? And for what purpose do such journeys and missions serve?
Neither among us Plejarans nor among our federates is there space tourism, for the populations only undertake journeys through space when there is an urgent need to do so. Space flights to other planets, etc., are only undertaken for economic trading purposes and the like, and for missionary purposes, and for assistance to Plejarans' foreign planets and their populations, as well as for exploration and reconnaissance purposes.